Welcome to another quick and quirky from things you don't know. Here is something you may have encountered without ever really thinking about it. Pick up a traditional men's shirt, and the buttons are on the wearer's right. Pick up a traditional women's blouse, and they're usually on the wearer's left. Same basic job, same basic piece of clothing, but opposite sides.
Yeah, and this is one of those customs that becomes especially noticeable when you accidentally put on a shirt designed for the other category. Your hands immediately tell you that something is different. You have performed this little motion thousands of times, and suddenly the buttons seem to be in the wrong place.
The obvious question, ladies and gentlemen, is why? Unfortunately, history does not give us a nice document saying, on this date, the King of Burgundy officially decided that women button on the left and men button on the right. Historians have several explanations, some more convincing than others, and the real answer may be that several old customs gradually combined into the convention we have today. Buttons themselves are very old, but the shirt as we recognize it has changed considerably. For centuries, friends, the European man's shirt was essentially an undergarment. Before the 19th century, many shirts did not open completely down the front. Instead, a person pulled the shirt over his head through an opening at the neck and the upper chest. Thankful I don't have to do that. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London notes that the center front pocket, the strip carrying the buttons and the buttonholes on a modern shirt, was largely a 19th century development. During that century, the front buttoning shirt became increasingly recognizable as the garment we know and wear today.
So, when we ask why shirts button differently, we are really looking at several centuries of clothing traditions that eventually became incorporated into modern shirts and blouses.
Which also explains why there probably isn't just one inventor responsible for this. Fashion conventions can develop slowly until everyone follows them without even remembering why they started in the first place.
Yeah, that's true. And the explanation you will hear most often concerns wealthy women and their servants. Upper class European women's clothing could be quite complicated, you know? Depending on the period, dressing might involve several layers, lacing, hooks, corsets, petticoats, fasteners, and eventually buttons.
A wealthy woman could have a maid or other servant to help her dress. Imagine the servant standing in front of the woman and fastening her clothing. Because most people are right handed, placing the buttons on the woman's left would put them conveniently on the servant's right as the two faced each other.
Meanwhile, a man was likely to button his own clothing. For a right handed man, having the buttons on his own right side was comfortable and familiar.
Yeah, that sounds sensible, and it is probably the most widely repeated explanation. But we should emphasize something important. It is a theory, not a proven historical fact. We don't have an order from some royal tailor announcing that all women's buttons were being moved because the maids requested it.
That's right, and there was an obvious objection here. Most women throughout history were not aristocrats. They dressed themselves. Why would a fashion design for wealthy women determine how everybody else's clothing worked?
Because, Chandler, wealthy people historically had enormous influence over fashion. The growing middle classes copied styles that began at the royal court or among the upper classes and were eventually mass produced and imitated much more widely.
And later, when factories began producing clothing in large quantities, manufacturers needed standards. Once women's clothing traditionally fastened one way and men's clothing the other, there was little reason for manufacturers to reverse the system.
I was very surprised to hear But there's another explanation that concerns men rather than women: weapons. For much of European history, a right-handed man carrying a sword normally wore it on his left side. That allowed him to reach across his body with the right hand and draw it. One theory holds that the direction in which men's coats and jackets overlapped helped prevent the sword hilt from catching in the garment's opening as the weapon was drawn. Military clothing and armor also developed particular overlap patterns for practical reasons. Those traditions, according to my friends at Smithsonian Magazine, may have influenced civilian menswear.
So now we potentially have two separate traditions. Women's clothing may have been arranged partly for someone standing in front of the wearer, while men's clothing may have developed around a man dressing himself and carrying weapons.
Which is probably more realistic than expecting one explanation to account for every garment worn over several centuries.
Here's another factor. Medieval armor gives us another possible clue. When armor plates overlapped, the direction mattered because you didn't want an enemy's weapon easily slipping between them. Historical discussions of European armor have suggested that the traditional left-to-right overlap of men's garments may be connected with the way armored men presented the shielded side of the body towards an opponent. That does not prove that armor created the modern button arrangement, but it shows the direction that the clothing overlapped could once have had practical consequences.
Now, today, your greatest danger while buttoning a shirt is probably discovering that you skipped a button halfway down. A medieval soldier had somewhat more serious concerns, though.
Yeah, for sure. Here's another theory, which involves horseback riding. For centuries, respectable European women were often expected to ride side saddle instead of sitting astride a horse.
In a typical side saddle position, the rider's body was oriented differently from someone riding astride. One suggestion is that women's garments were made to overlap in their traditional direction so that wind would be less likely to blow through the opening as the horse moved.
Plausible?
Yes, Chandler, it's plausible enough to mention. Absolutely proven? No.
Yeah, and when we say that the wind would be less likely to blow directly through the opening, that could open things and expose them, you see. The distinction matters throughout this story. We're dealing with historical explanations reconstructed from clothing practices rather than a surviving rule book explaining exactly why the custom began.
Now, this is quite interesting. There are still more theories. One claims women traditionally held babies on the left side while breastfeeding, leaving the dominant right hand free. The direction of the blouse opening might therefore have made nursing or handling clothing much easier.
Again, it does sound plausible, but possibility isn't evidence.
And then, as with so many other things in the 19th century, we arrive at our old friend Napoleon Bonaparte.
Of course we do, Dr. Dineen.
There is a story claiming women mocked Napoleon's habit of posing with one hand tucked inside his waistcoat, what Americans call a vest. So Napoleon supposedly ordered women's clothing to fasten in the opposite direction throughout the French Empire.
It's a colorful story, but there isn't good evidence that Napoleon issued such an order. It belongs in the interesting legend category rather than the reliable history category. Smithsonian includes it among the more speculative explanations for the custom.
Whatever caused the difference, industrialization probably explains why we're still dealing with it today.
Exactly, Chandler. By the 19th and early 20th century, clothing manufacturing was becoming increasingly standardized. Manufacturers had patterns for men's garments and different patterns for women's garments. Customers became accustomed to buttons being on particular sides. As I said at the beginning, The modern front buttoning shirt itself became established during the 19th century, and women later adopted versions of the tailored shirt as women's work and everyday clothing changed.
Once millions of people expect a men's shirt to button one way and a women's blouse to button another, changing the system doesn't accomplish much. Tradition becomes its own reason for continuing the tradition.
There is another explanation here that comes from something women historically did far more often than men did. And that was dressing the young children. Mothers routinely fastened their children's clothes before the children were old enough to manage buttons themselves.
The theory is that the arrangement of boys' clothing may have developed partly around that experience. A mother facing a young boy would be buttoning his shirt from the opposite perspective. As the boy grew older and began dressing himself, the familiar arrangement remained, but he was now working the buttons from his own side.
It's an interesting possibility because children's clothing habits could certainly help preserve a convention from one generation to the next. But like the servant, sword, and side saddle explanations, a little alliteration there, we should not present it as proven, only as a possibility. I regret there is no known historical document saying men's shirts button this way because mothers dress their sons.
What it does remind us is that clothing traditions can survive for several reasons at once. Servants dressing wealthy women, mothers dressing their children, men dressing themselves, military clothing, and eventually factory standardization may have all helped reinforce which side seemed normal for whom.
Does it matter much today?
Not very much today, Dr. Weaver. Most people dress themselves today. Most of us aren't carrying swords, and few people are commuting to work side saddle. And generally, we don't have servants fastening our shirts for us.
Yet clothing manufacturers still commonly preserve the distinction because consumers recognize it. It's also useful in stores because the direction of the buttons can sometimes help identify whether a garment was originally marketed as men's or women's clothing.
But I must say, Dr. Weaver, even that isn't absolute. Unisex garments, designer clothing, jackets, and various casual fashion don't always follow the old convention. We may logically say it is a tradition rather than an absolute law.
So, if someone asks why men's and women's shirts button on opposite sides, the most responsible answer is this: we don't know for certain.
The strongest traditional explanation, as we said, is that upper class women were frequently assisted to dress by servants who stood facing them, while men more often fastened their own clothing. Men's military traditions involving swords and armor may also have influenced the direction men's garments overlapped.
Other ideas like side saddle riding, nursing, Napoleon, and several others are interesting, but they have less evidence behind them.
And mass produced clothing eventually froze the distinction into place. What may once have been a practical purpose became simply the way men's and women's clothing was made.
Okay, now we have covered 10 points here. The basic difference: men's shirts traditionally have buttons on the wearer's right. Women's shirts and blouses traditionally have them on the wearer's left. Buttons have a long history, but the modern full length button shirt developed gradually. Shirts that opened all the way down the front became common during the 19th century. The servant theory: wealthy women were often dressed by their servants. Reversing the buttons may have made fastening elaborate clothing easier for a right handed servant facing the wearer.
Why men were different. Men generally dressed themselves, so putting the buttons on the right was convenient for a right handed wearer. The sword theory. Men commonly carried swords on the left and drew them with the right hand. The direction clothing overlap may have reduced interference with weapons. The armor theory. Military clothing and armor also overlapped in particular directions for protection, possibly influencing later menswear.
Yeah, and then there's the side saddle theory. Women's riding side saddle may have benefited from clothing overlapping in the direction that reduced wind entering the garment. There are some other theories, like holding babies, breastfeeding, and even Napoleon may have been offered as explanations, but evidence for these ideas is weak. There's another one. Mass production made the difference permanent. Once manufacturers standardized women's clothing, changing the convention became unnecessary and potentially confusing. But lastly, today, I kind of think it's mostly tradition. There is little practical reason for the difference anymore, and unisex clothing sometimes ignores the old rule entirely.
Which means every time you button a shirt, you may be repeating a routine shaped by servants, aristocratic fashion, 19th century factories, and possibly even medieval weapons.
That's one of the interesting things about clothing, Chandler. Something that looks completely arbitrary today may be the surviving trace of an elegant world in which people dressed differently, traveled differently, fought differently, and organized their society very differently.
And that is exactly the sort of little mystery that we like on Quick and Quirky. The next time you put on a shirt, look at which side the buttons are on. They may not be one perfectly proven explanation for why they're there, but there is several hundred years of history behind them.
Hey, listen, thank you for joining us for another quick and quirky from things you don't know. If there's another ordinary object or strange custom you've always wondered about, put it in the comments. Please, it might become one of our next episodes. You just never know. For Dr. Dineen and Dr. Weaver and myself, goodbye for now, and we'll see you again soon.